Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our last webinar of the year in the series Protests in American History. For those who are just joining us for the first time, welcome. For our longtime viewers who have been here for all six, we are so grateful that you've been here through this incredible journey this year where we've looked at the history of protests in American history. Each of the months that we've done have either been thematic or we've kind of gone chronologically. And this one at the end is a little bit of both. We're going to be looking at LGBTQ protests, and also thematically, these are kind of the later protests chronologically in this series. I'm Dr. Chloe Northrup. I am on the Northeast campus, and I'm a professor of history. And my co-moderator and host is Misty Wilson from Connect Campus. And so we would like to just thank everybody who's participated this year and our deans and all the admins who have been really supportive of this process throughout the year as well. Our three speakers today are hailing from different campuses, and we are just glad that you are all, that the three of them have come to join us today. Our first speaker is Aubrey Calvin, whose pronouns are she, her, and she has been an assistant professor of government at the Northwest campus of Tarrant County College since 2011. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from Oklahoma State University and has taken additional classes at the University of North Texas, where I went for graduate school. So yay, North UNT, shout out. Her political science focus is on the various intersections between race, interest groups, LGBTQ rights, and public law. In addition to teaching, Aubrey is a freelance writer and podcaster. Her work has appeared in the Dallas Voice, Nerdist, and she's a regular contributor to Gay Parent magazine. Aubrey is also the co-host of the podcast Southern Queries, which explores LGBTQ life in the South. When not teaching or writing, she enjoys spending time with her wife, nerding out to Doctor Who and other science fiction shows, and subjecting their teenage preteen daughter to the wonders of 90s music. I love all of this, and now I have so many questions already for the end before you've even got started. So our first speaker today is Aubrey, and we welcome her talk today.
All right, thank you, Chloe. All right, so today I just wanted to do a quick talk about the queer rights movement before Stonewall. And because a lot of people think that the more historic, 1969 Stonewall uprising was just this iconic thing that started the whole push for LGBTQ rights, and they think that in the same way that they think that Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott started the Black civil rights movement. And we know that both of those are not true. In fact, before Stonewall, there were actually a few decades that I want to focus on where there was a lot of activism to try to achieve some form of queer rights. And that is because, if you could tell by this first picture, the way homosexuality was used, was viewed, was that it was either a mental illness, you were either crazy if you were attracted to someone of the same sex, or if you had a gender non-conforming identity, or you were a deviant of some kind or perverted. But the basic idea was that this was a problem that you could be cured from. And it was actually something that many people were subjected to horrible psychiatric treatments. Many people lost their freedom, were locked away in hospitals and things like that. So this was a fight that began long before Stonewall. And so just to highlight a few, and okay, all right. I can never find it. Okay, so just going back to the 1840s and the 1850s, and we're not going to go every single decade because that would take way too long. The 1840s and 50s were when we first saw laws against public cross-dressing. So this is where we actually had laws that said if you were a woman out in public wearing men's clothing, unless you were in some kind of a farm situation, or if you're a male in perceived women's dress, you could get fined. And originally, these laws were not meant to target LGBTQ people. A lot of them were originally meant to target people who were trying to avoid paying taxes by pretending they were someone else or pretending that they were of Native American descent. But as with any law, they soon discovered that once it's on the books, you can really use it towards any situation. And so this first picture you have here, there is a man named William Dorsey Swan, who was considered one of the very first drag queens. And he was born a slave in Maryland. And then he went on to get involved in drag balls. He was arrested several times. Once he was arrested for stealing books out of a library, and he asked that his sentence be overturned, and that he was asked that he be pardoned. And basically, this idea of drag culture or ball culture goes back all the way to the 1860s, at least. However, this is not a picture of William Dorsey Swan. We don't have a picture of him. This is actually someone named from the vaudeville troupe Gregory and Brown. And they were a duo vaudeville group that were also known for doing gender nonconforming performances. Other things you could see when the law was against us, if you want to move forward 100 years, starting in the 1940s and then with an executive order in 1950, it was actually illegal to be gay and work for the government. And we know this is something called the Lavender Scare that you don't hear about as much, but this is along the same lines as the Red Scare, for when McCarthyism was trying to get all the communists out of government. The Lavender Scare had the same effect. And there were a lot of qualified people in very high-ranking positions that were actually ousted from their jobs because of this executive order signed by President Eisenhower. Well, believe it or not, the effect of that was that a lot of these homosexuals that lost their jobs ended up in the gay activism movement. Whereas before, they were quietly living their lives, trying to serve their country, and weren't very active in politics. By losing their jobs, the government kind of spurred on additional action to push towards same-sex rights and towards gender equality. And one of the reasons why we started to see this push against homosexuality, and we started to see a police crackdown against gay bars, gay clubs, and things like that, was that after World War II, a lot of the people that moved to the city, whether for factory jobs, moved to the city to do the work of running a city while people were overseas fighting the war, a lot of the servicemen that were overseas, once they came back, they didn't want to go back to their farms or their rural areas. They wanted to stay in the city. So they started to gather, if you will. And so this created this idea of gay locations, gay places, if you will, Greenwich Village, San Francisco. And so the crackdown, if you will, against gay bars was largely around the idea that cities need to do something around vice and corruption. And typically the vice and corruption they were talking about was organized crime. But organized crime was very difficult to come up against. Organized crime was very difficult to fight. And so it was a lot easier to just go arrest gay and lesbian people. It was an easier way of telling the public that they were fighting vice and trying to keep America pure. Keep in mind, this was the 1950s when there was still that push towards morality and trying to prove to the communists that Americans were more moral than the communists. I think, are we both doing the same thing? There we go. Okay. And so in the 1950s, one of the big ways that we tried to fight for equality was by convincing straight people that gays and lesbians were just like them. And then this is, of course, before the term transgender was popularized. When you say someone was gay or when someone was arrested as being a cross-dresser, We don't know what that meant. They could be gay, they could be gender nonconforming, they could be now what we would consider transgender. All we know is that they're operating outside of the accepted norms of society. And so two of the organizations that formed, one was the Mattachine Society, and it formed in 1950. And the idea behind the Mattachine Society, and it was mainly middle-class white men. And the whole push there was to show America that gay men looked just like straight men. And so their orders were always dress nice, dress appropriately, wear a suit and tie, to prove to society, we're just like you. And then because the Mattachine Society was so male-oriented and was pretty misogynistic, women didn't feel welcome there. So women formed the Daughters of Bilitis, which was formed in Los Angeles in 1953. And they had this similar idea, showing America that women could have a nice feminine presence and a feminine dress, even though they were attracted to women and not men. And in terms of publications, both of these societies spread nationally, although they were most popular in the North and the Midwest and the East. They did exist in the South, but only to a lesser extent. The Daughters of Bilitis had The Ladder, and that was their publication that went national. And then you had this magazine called One, and One is actually an offshoot of the Mattachine Society. The people who started One, which is the gay magazine, they kind of started with the Mattachine Society and then broke away. There was some tension there, if you will. And these publications actually had difficulty getting sent nationally because, according to federal law, they were considered obscene. And so the FBI would raid the offices of the people printing them. The U.S. Postal Service actually refused to send them in the mail. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that these were not obscene, that the U.S. Post Office couldn't stop these from being mailed out, but most people were still closeted, so they were still sent in plain brown paper packaging and sent to very discreet packaging, so no one would really know. But this is kind of how the word spread, if you will, about homosexuality. In fact, The Ladder is notable in that if anyone has ever heard of the play A Raisin in the Sun with Lorraine Hansberry, she was a closeted lesbian. And she actually wrote to The Ladder several times using pseudonyms, explaining the difficulty of being a Black woman who felt she could not come out. She could not really be free to be a lesbian fully. And she felt she had to conform to the norms of not only being a woman, but also being a Black woman. And so that's also pretty significant. Outside of the idea of civility and trying to prove to America that gays and lesbians were just like straight people, we did see a level of resistance start to form in the late 50s and in the early 60s. And a few of these were spontaneous. You know, I mentioned earlier how cops would raid gay bars and arrest a lot of gay men and women. Well, that's only if you could get into the gay bar. Many gay bars were actually quite racist and weren't welcoming to people of color, weren't welcome to what we would call drag queens or people that were trans, and people who were pretty poor. And so if you are of that ilk, you often found yourself spending your time at someplace like Cooper's Donuts or at Compton's Cafeteria, two kind of all-night places where sex workers would go to hang out. And these were both in California, and because the police knew that these were known hangouts for trans people, for cross-dressers, it would be easy to go in and arrest them to get their quotas, to get their vice numbers, and to show that they're doing something to keep these evil cross-dressers off the streets, if you will. Well, in May of 1959 at Cooper's Donuts, there was actually a huge pushback where this was one of the very first riots where sex workers and trans people and gay people actually protested the police violence that was used against them. And many people don't know about Cooper's Donuts. Another less well-known one was the Compton's Cafeteria riot. And Compton is not the city. Compton's was the name of the owner who owned is like Compton's Cafeteria. It's like a last name ownership kind of thing. And that one was in 1966. And so you did see a lot of this kind of riot or protest against police brutality start to happen a few years before Stonewall. So while Stonewall was the bigger one, and it did last 3 days and it did get the most attention, this idea of fighting against police brutality was not inherently new. And it's important to notice that these two riots were quite spontaneous. There were other protests that were more peaceful oriented. So if you see this middle picture here, that's from the Independence Hall protest in 1965, and that's in Philadelphia. And I forget if that was organized by ECHO or by the Mattachine Society, but the basic idea was that you come, you dress in your nicest clothing, you're very peaceful, you wear your picket, you hold your picket signs, but you don't cause trouble, trying to show that, again, that level of civility. But it was a risk because these people could get arrested. In fact, I don't know how well you can see, but this woman here in the glasses, her name is Ernestine Eckstein, and she was one of the few Black women involved that was willing to be photographed in a lot of these peaceful protests. And Ernestine Eckstein always wore sunglasses. She never actually protested in the city that she lived in. And we know now that Eckstein was in fact a pseudonym. That was not her real last name, because she did have to try to protect herself from retribution, losing a job, because what happens when you used to get arrested for being gay was that a lot of times the law was iffy. There are these things like there are a lot of laws where you were arrested, but they had to later drop the charges because the arrest may not stick, but they would publish your name in the newspaper. So even though your arrest record might not be there, you had a level of public shame. And so all of this is what led up to the idea of Stonewall. And I'm not going to talk about that because, as I said, I'm stopping right before it. But you should know that Stonewall was significant, but it was not by means the first protest. And I think that is my 15 minutes with 18 seconds to spare. I think that's all I have. So I'll take questions at the end if there are any.
Thank you so much, Aubrey, for that wonderful talk. And yes, just as a quick reminder, please put questions in the live event Q&A. And also we will have in that same spot the place for attendance at the end. I know that many of you would like to make sure that your attendance was marked, that you were here today. Our second speaker, who is going to be talking about 1987 Second National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, is Dr. Karen Wisely, who graduated with a PhD in history from the University of North Texas. Her dissertation examined Dallas LGBTQ rights movement from the 1960s through the 1990s, and she is currently an associate professor of history at the Northeast campus and has been quarantining for over a year with her cat Walnut in Denton. Please welcome Dr. Karen Wisely from the Northeast campus.
Thank you, Dr. Northrup. I put that in there as kind of a cry for help. I don't know. Yeah, I put that in there as kind of a cry for help, that I am alone in my apartment with my cat, and that can never be a good thing, I don't think. I can't control this, so I don't know if Misty, you can get to the beginning, and I'll just give you a hand signal when I'm gonna. All right. I'm gonna throw you a curveball in this talk about 1987's Second National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights by beginning to talk about the first National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights in 1979. In the years following Stonewall, and I realized we didn't really get into Stonewall, but what kind of separates the years before Stonewall from the years after Stonewall is radicalism a little bit. The movement that Aubrey was just describing is pretty conservative, and the movement after the Stonewall after the Stonewall riots was a little bit more radical. And so in the years after that Stonewall riot, the movement had grown significantly. The gay liberation organizations flourished across the nation, in isolated communities, in large urban centers, and on college campuses. And they coexisted somewhat peacefully with the earlier, more conservative homophile organizations that Aubrey was talking about that had already been established. The fledgling movement had shown the ability to draw large crowds at the first few of what would become annual Pride celebrations, but there was no real national movement. People first thought about organizing a national march for gay and lesbian rights in 1973 when a group in Illinois thought the movement was fragmented and wanted unity. There were barriers, however, to creating a national movement, including cultural differences, lack of representation in the press, and a large percentage of the community who were still deeply closeted. In the following years, activists from different parts of the country would take up this call for a national march on Washington, but nothing really came of it until the assassination in 1978 of Harvey Milk, who was the first openly gay politician elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. His assassination, along with the mayor of San Francisco, by a man named Dan White, who would get a very lenient sentence for this assassination, that is going to fuel the desire to plan a march. And people will meet in Philadelphia in late February of 1979 and decide to march in that very same year in October to celebrate 10 years after the Stonewall riots. So, I think next. On October 14th, 1979, the gay liberation movement commemorated the 10th anniversary of the Stonewall riots that represented its symbolic beginnings by marching on Washington. The United States Park Police estimated that 50,000 gay men and lesbians were present and marched down Pennsylvania Avenue behind the White House and gathered in the National Mall to demand equal rights. Other estimates go as high as 100,000, so we're not sure. It could be anywhere from 50 to 100,000. To some, however, that turnout was disappointingly low. If you saw on the last slide, they were expecting 1 million marchers. 100,000 at the maximum seems like a low turnout, and especially when you compare it to other marches that had happened in recent years, like the 250,000 that gathered to hear Martin Luther King Jr. deliver his I Have a Dream speech in 1963, or the nearly 400,000 who protested the Vietnam War in 1969. After all, one important goal of this event was to show Washington's politicians that gay people were a significant portion of the population whose rights could not be overlooked. The paltry attendance, combined with the almost complete lack of media attention, allowed those outside the community to point to the march as a failure. But lesbians and gay men had made significant, I messed up, sorry, had made significant progress in their quest for equality during the 10 years since Stonewall. Any disappointment experienced by those involved in the event stemmed primarily from the realization that while conditions improved to where more and more individuals felt confident enough to come out and live openly, they had a long way to go on a national level. In fact, other than successfully lobbying the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its Manual of Mental Disorders in 1973, most of the progress had occurred locally. The movement still lacked a national central organization. Perhaps the major accomplishment of the march was that it provided concrete evidence to the lesbians and gay men in Washington and across the nation that they were not alone. Those able to travel to the demonstration met with like-minded individuals and exchanged ideas. Of course, the event was not all business. The revelers showed little restraint in their pursuit of a good time. One attendee commented, "If Stonewall marked the beginning of the modern gay movement, the first national queer march in 1979 was its coming out party." The marchers, therefore, left the nation's capital energized to continue the fight for equality in their hometowns. And then AIDS happened. This is not a talk about AIDS, however, but a talk about the Second National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. So I'm not going to go into incredible detail about the AIDS epidemic and the absolute devastation that it inflicted on the LGBT community. A whole generation of charismatic leaders lost to the AIDS crisis set the movement back. No one can ever know how far back. While thousands died, both in the gay community and outside of it, many felt that the Reagan administration was purposefully delaying the release of any federal funds to support research into the cause and possible cure of the illness. Representative Harry Waxman of California stated, "There's no doubt in my mind that if the same disease had appeared among Americans of Norwegian descent or among tennis players rather than gay males, the responses of the government and the medical community would have been different." Reagan's seemingly indifference to the growing epidemic, more than 41,000 people had already died of the disease, there was no cure in sight, and the government wasn't spending much money to find one, combined with the 1986 Bowers v. Hardwick decision by the Supreme Court that upheld Georgia's sodomy law, prompted a call for a second march. On October 11th, 1987, a crowd of gays and lesbians numbering anywhere from 200 to 600,000 gathered in the nation's capital for that second march on Washington. Gay historian Lillian Fodderman said there were 6 times as many marchers as there'd been in 1979 because there was so much more now to be mad about and to mourn. The day before, Saturday, October 10th, a mass wedding and protest had taken place in front of the Internal Revenue Service building to call for the legal recognition of lesbian and gay relationships. 2,000 same-sex couples pledged their vows in a ceremony as another 4,000 to 5,000 looked on. The mass wedding was presided over by Minister Dina Batchelor, but of course was not legally binding because not one single state in 1987 officially recognized same-sex marriage. At sunrise the next day, the 11th of October, the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt was unfurled on the National Mall between the Capitol and the Washington Monument. The quilt was the brainchild of Cleve Jones, who saw the quilt as a political statement that would sidestep the issue of gay male sexuality to focus on the larger message that these people who died of AIDS belonged to the American family and had been loved. It was made up of thousands of rectangular 3-foot by 6-foot handmade panels, 3-foot by 6-foot to reflect the size that a grave and a coffin would be, each in memory of a person who died of AIDS. Precisely at dawn, there began a simple reading of names, 8 at a time. As each group of 8 names was spoken, volunteers unwrapped a panel of 8 quilt blocks sewn together. 3 hours later, when the names had all been read, the quilt stood under the morning sunlight as a sea of gay people and those who loved them walked along the fabric borders, wiping tears from their eyes. According to historian John D'Amelio, who was on the National Mall when the AIDS memorial quilt was displayed for the very first time, instead of individual, silent, pent-up grief, the quilt had made it possible for grief to be shared, released, and finished within a collective fashion, and for the lives of those who had died to be remembered with dignity and respect. Next came the march itself, sometimes referred to as the Great March due to its success, size, scope, and historical importance. Hundreds of thousands of LGBT people and their allies made their way down Pennsylvania Avenue. The demonstration was peaceful and generally free of problems. There was a small cadre of counter-protesters with signs saying, "God is angry with the wicked," but marchers simply responded by singing, "We shall overcome," and continued right on past. At the end of the march, there was a rally with speakers. Like leader of the Rainbow Coalition and candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, Jesse Jackson, go ahead, actor and comedian Whoopi Goldberg, former National Organization for Women president Eleanor Schmiel, United Farm Workers Union president Cesar Chavez, and openly gay House of Representative members Barney Frank and Jerry Studs, both of Massachusetts. Thousands of gays and lesbians who'd come to the march on Sunday remained in Washington the following week so they could descend on the Supreme Court and let the justices know what they thought of the Bowers v. Hardwick decision. On October 13th, 1987, a mass civil disobedience action in front of the Supreme Court was greeted by 300 policemen holding batons at the ready and wearing visors and yellow latex gloves to keep them safe from AIDS. The gay protesters chanted, "Your gloves don't match your shoes. They'll see it on the news." Because gay protesters are infinitely clever. For 6 hours, demonstrators scattered pink paper triangles like confetti, saying, "America the Beautiful," and "We are a gentle, angry people." They chanted, "Equal justice under the law. That's what it says on the wall." 600 protesters were arrested for breaking through barricades and running up onto the building's plaza, where it was illegal to protest. That was the largest mass arrest in DC since the Vietnam War protests, and significantly more than those arrested on January 6th of this year. Ultimately, just 8 years after the disappointing showing at the 1979 March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights, the estimated crowd of more than 500,000 at the Second National March on Washington for gay and lesbian rights in October 1987 showed that the devastation of the AIDS crisis had unified the LGBT community like nothing else could and had made the movement a national one. The next year, to commemorate the great success of the 1987 March, organizers established National Coming Out Day, which is celebrated every October 11th.
Thank you so much, Karen. The part about the quilt is always so incredibly touching to see. I'm looking forward to engaging with that with some questions at the end. Just as one more reminder, make sure to put in your questions and we will have some discussion at the end of this talk. Our very last today is from Rick Sagel, who is an associate professor of government at the Trinity River campus. As a licensed attorney in Texas, his teaching and research focus on how court decisions affect everyday life. And so we are now going to hear from Professor Stagel about the protests of the Westboro Baptist Church. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Northrup and Professor Mertens Wilson for having me. I didn't expect that photo. I sent that photo as a backup, and not that I don't like it. It's a good photo. It just kind of surprised me. So thank you for the love of showing that one. I think it's Professor Mertens Wilson is the one who did that. But thank you guys for having me. I appreciate when Trinity River gets asked to do something. It means a lot to us here. And I was really excited when I was asked to present a protest-related, presentation. I knew exactly what I wanted to do, because when I teach federal government, one of my favorite topics is the First Amendment, and then one of my favorite subtopics is talking about the Westboro Baptist Church. Now, some of you probably have heard of them. Some of you may be more intimately aware of them. I don't mean intimate in a weird way. I mean you just know more about them. Because they've been covered by the media quite well. And I think there's probably a few documentaries that have covered the Westboro Baptist Church. So I hope that you guys are a little bit aware of them, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what they did and how it's changed or maybe not changed the First Amendment. So I think it's helpful to know what the First Amendment actually says when it comes to protest. There's a lot in the First Amendment. It talks about speech, it talks about religion, it talks about press, and it talks about the right to peacefully assemble. So here's what it says. It says, Congress shall make no law abridging, let me make sure I get this right, hold on, abridging the right of the people to peaceably to assemble. That's all it says. Like, that's all we have to go on. So when we're talking about protesting and we're talking about what you can do when you protest, that's really what the government has to go by, is that Congress shall make no law that abridges our right to peacefully assemble. Of course, assemble and protest go hand in hand. So when you have that as the backdrop, it's kind of, it gives us a lot more leeway in what we can do, what we can say, and how we can do it. So as my previous two colleagues have told you about, there's been a long history of Americans protesting, usually for minority rights, obviously, right? You're not going to protest unless you've been wronged, okay? So the ones that tend to get the most media attention are the ones that, are either a up-and-coming issue like gun violence. That's been a big one recently. The Women's March has happened, the last few years, and more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement became very, very much covered in the media after the killing of George Floyd. So when it comes to Westboro, and I want to change my slide here, let me see if this works. It's a tiny little button. Misty, maybe you can do that for me. Next slide. Slide. There we go. Okay, so this is Westboro, and I picked, if you Google, I actually urge you not to Google Westboro Baptist Church, because if you do, you'll see signs that are fairly inflammatory and may make you upset. I picked a few that are not quite as upsetting, but so this is what they do, okay? Westboro has been around for a while. They've been around actually since the 50s, but only in the last 30 or so years have they become a bit more selective in their media coverage, or how they solicit media coverage. So let me go back a little bit. They call themselves Old School Baptist, and I really hate that the word Baptist is in their name, because they're not Baptist. What they believe, what they preach is hate. And it's a very small church. It's less than 100 people. They are not a major church. They don't have any satellite churches around the country that I'm aware of. They're located in Topeka, Kansas. And it's a cult, right? The word church is being very kind to let them use the word church, but that's the way it works. So in the 80s, they were not that well known until the murder of a young gay man named Matthew Shepard. Matthew Shepard was an openly gay college student in Wyoming. and he was brutally murdered by two men who killed him because he was gay. And even before Westboro got involved, this was a big news story. It was big because the way he was killed was incredibly violent, and the fact that he was killed because he was gay were major talking points in the media. So that was one thing. And then Westboro decided that if we go to this funeral and we protest, we picket with our signs, then we're going to get some media coverage, because this is a very sensitive story, and the way he was murdered, and we just think that this would be good for us, right, to protest this funeral. So they do that, and of course they get media coverage, because how could somebody actually do this, right? How could somebody take this time where it's supposed to be solemn, it's supposed to be a very peaceful, quiet memorial for someone's murder? How could you actually go there and protest? Well, they did it. And this is how they started making news. They didn't stop there. They saw how it got them coverage, and actually they were fairly intelligent about it. Their whole goal is to get the world to understand their message of mostly that homosexuality is a sin, and that whatever bad happens to us from mass shootings, terrorism, war, that's because America accepts homosexuality. That is their number one message primarily. So they would go, of course, to these events that were related to gay rights, lesbian rights. But then they started going to other things that were not related to that. They would go to the funeral of a murdered child, like not related at all to gay rights. They would go to, in the 2000s, they would start going to a soldier who was killed in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they would go protest at their funeral. And so on your screen, you see some of the signs. Again, I picked a image that did not have some ugly phrases, because most of their signage was full of hate speech, okay? Full of hateful messages, things that if a family member had seen that, it would just be very uncomforting and upsetting to families, right? But they keep doing this. And it's interesting to know that a lot of the elders or the people involved in the church, it's mostly family run, the Phelps family. Most of them are lawyers. And so they, I'm smiling because I am one. I'm not smiling because they understood that they were right. They understood that they had the constitutional right to be doing this, and they wanted challenges. They wanted people to try to stop them from protesting so they could win and say, hey, look, our message is right. We have the right to do this, and so forth. So fast forward a little bit further, and at some point, slide, and you go to the next one, Misty. At some point, they protest at a funeral of a soldier killed in Iraq, and the father of the victim, the son, sees these signs. He gets very upset, right? And he sues the church for emotional distress, infliction of emotional distress, okay? And he wins at the lower courts. And the Phelps Westboro Baptist Church says, no, we're going to appeal this because this is not right. This is, he is a emotional character. You're giving him way too much emotional credit for this. This is not an emotional thing. This is a constitutional thing. So it actually goes to the Supreme Court, and it is very, very, very rare for a case to go all the way to the Supreme Court. It just doesn't happen very often, especially a freedom of speech issue or freedom of assembly issue. So it goes to the court. 2010 is when it goes to the court. And this is actually a very easy case because this was a peaceful protest. The father is not arguing that it wasn't peaceful. It was. He's arguing that the messages on the signs inflicted great distress on him. So think about that. And think about if the government should be allowed to basically censor signs that you make. We've seen protests get violent. We've seen marches get violent, right? That is one thing. And that's why the Constitution says peacefully to assemble. The only reason Westboro may not have been peaceful is because somebody tried to fight them or somebody pushed them, right? They were never ones to actually become violent. They were trained very well. Hey, look, if you guys get yelled at, if you get taunted, just you can talk back to them, but you do not get violent, because when you become violent, that's when the police can stop us. Okay, so it goes to the court, and the court discusses the case. And whenever I have my face-to-face class, I love showing them the video of the outcome, because what the video shows, it shows the signs, it shows the people, and you're led to believe that how could the court rule for the church, right? These signs are awful, they're horrible messages. How could the Supreme Court side with these horrible people? Well, of course they were, right? Because their messages are protected by the First Amendment. Next slide. And the court heard the case, and they decided 8-1 that the church was protected. One of my favorite lines in recent Supreme Court decision history was this by Chief Justice John Roberts. I'll read it to you all. Speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, and as it did here, inflict great pain. On the facts before us, we cannot react to that pain by punishing the speaker. So this, to me, really summarizes the power of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is not here for people that have normal opinions. It is there to protect the extreme, the fringes of society who have beliefs that we don't like. And just because, and this goes to race, this goes to sexual orientation, this goes to, any extreme issue you can think of. Really, that's what the First Amendment ultimately protects, because those are the people that tend to get to the court, the ones that have these extreme positions. So the government's job is not to punish the speaker. That is for public discourse, right? That is for the public to figure out. And there's always going to be people that differ opinion-wise. The First Amendment makes it fairly clear that the government's job is not to pick winners and losers. It is to basically protect that speech. But one more slide, Misty, and I'll be done. But if you are upset that Westboro won, I will give you a final uplifting message. As I mentioned before, Westboro is in Topeka, which is a fairly small town in Kansas. About 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, the house across the street was for sale from the actual church. Somebody bought that house and they painted it in the rainbow flag colors, the gay pride rainbow flag colors. So that is still there, by the way. So the Westboro Church right across the street is this. So if you like, if you think that is somehow equal or that they got theirs, then that is one way to look at it. But the government can't stop this either. So I want to thank you guys for hearing me. And if you have questions, I think I'm the last one, so I will stop talking and I will gladly answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our three speakers today for such fascinating topics that kind of bring us up and wrap up this whole theme this year about protest. So we've seen different forms of protest today that range from material culture to outright protests to some that are controversial. And it seems interesting because this year we might have had a lot of, I would say, affinity towards a lot of the protesters. And it's, I'm going to say it's difficult for some of the things that we've seen today to have more of a sympathy towards them with the Westboro Church, particularly in some of these. And I'm seeing that in the chat echoing as well. So the first question, we're going to direct this to Aubrey. It says, is the Lavender Scare also about the fear of communism? Did they think that homosexuals somehow were more likely to be communists? So that is our first question for Professor Calvin.
Yes, in fact, it was more than I think. A lot of people involved in the early homophile movement were communists. Or were at least had socialist or communist bents to them. That was part of what spurred that activism for equality. So yeah, the two were definitely closely tied together. And in fact, there's like even in the Black Civil Rights Movement, there were people that were kind of pushed to the background because of their socialist or communist leanings, like a Bayard Rustin. So yeah, it's a pretty close. There's a pretty good link to them. I don't know if anybody heard me.
Yes, thank you. All right, the next question is for Dr. Wisely. Can you explain why pink triangles are a symbol?
Pink triangles as a symbol for LGBT people goes back to the Holocaust during World War II. The Holocaust, we know that more than 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, but there were also other people who were killed alongside Jewish people, and the Roma people were killed, and gay people also were in concentration camps and death camps, and they wore a symbol on the breast of their uniforms, and the Star of David was for the Jews, and for gay people it was a pink triangle. So that is where that symbolism comes from, and so that's why they were using that as basically as confetti.
Thank you. And continuing on with the conversation for Dr. Wisely, can you explain a little bit more about the AIDS quilt? Do you see this as a form of protest? And could anyone make a panel for the quilt? And where is this quilt now?
It's a lot of questions. All right. Yes, I do kind of see it as a protest, because at the same time that they were creating an AIDS quilt to memorialize the people who were dead, there's a group called ACT UP. It's the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And ACT UP was a very radical organization within the gay rights movement as a whole, because most of the members of it, most of the people who were on the front lines of ACT UP actually had AIDS or were HIV positive, and they had it at a time in the late 1980s and early 1990s when being diagnosed HIV positive was almost a certain death sentence. And so there was a kind of a radicalism in them, born of desperation, because they were trying to get changes to, for example, the FDA, approving drugs for to fight AIDS and that sort of thing. And one of the things that they consistently did was draw attention to the number of people who had died, whether they, sometimes they like nail crosses in the lawns before, the city hall and things like that. Sometimes they drew outlines of chalk outlines of people to demonstrate how many people were dying of this disease. So in that way, the AIDS quilt also could be seen as a form of protest, because you can't deny when they unfurl this thing, and it was, the equivalent of like 3 football fields length worth of this quilt, that's a lot of people who have died. And they had only just started the quilt in 1987, so that has just continued to grow. How it all began is kind of interesting, because it goes back to, like I said, Cleve Jones. And Cleve Jones was a personal friend of Harvey Milk's. And after Harvey Milk was assassinated in San Francisco, annually they would have a march in San Francisco that would commemorate his life. And as the AIDS epidemic hit San Francisco, and it was one of the first places it hit, and so the numbers were really devastating really early there. Cleve Jones noticed how many people that had consistently come out to these marches weren't there anymore, and how many of his friends weren't there. So he suggested to some of the marchers that they turn their placards over and write the names of people who had died, that they were missing in these marches. And then when they got to the end of the march, they taped them up on the federal building in San Francisco. And Cleve Jones, whose grandmother had been a quilter, says that kind of looked like a quilt, and the idea was born. Because quilting, is like a middle America thing, and it was thought to be, the biggest gay communities were on the coast: New York, San Francisco, LA, and all of that. And so to bring the memorial into something that represented the middle of the country was important to him. Okay, did I answer all parts of that question, or was there something?
Yes. Where's the quilt today?
Oh, where's the quilt today? Oh, yes. And can anybody make a quilt panel? Yeah, you can make a quilt panel to commemorate a lost loved one in your life and submit it to the Names Project. The Names Project has grown exponentially. I think there's something like 44,000 or more panels of this thing now, and you can view it online, and it's fully searchable by keyword, by name, by town, and all of that, so that you can see some of the panels. It hasn't been displayed in its entirety in quite some time, but you can, if you have an organization or something, you can apply, and it's quite an intensive process to display one or two panels that are important to your communities.
Thank you.
Chloe, can I add something real quick about the AIDS quilt? Can I add on to what Dr. Wisely was saying real quick? What Dr. Wisely was saying about the panels is so interesting, because I know, these people in the middle of America, a lot of them the panels were sent in by moms who had lost their kids, and they felt alone, and they felt they didn't have anyone to talk to about it. So by quilting and sending their patches in, it kind of did help bring up this idea that AIDS affected everybody. And so it kind of helped bring middle America to the AIDS movement and help people feel less alone.
It is such, and it's such a different form of protest than I think we've seen this year, and such a beautiful reminder as well at the same time. That's a really fascinating thing to learn more about today. Thank you for both of you. Professor Stagel, there's several questions about the Westboro Baptist Church. One question is, why do they protest at children and soldier funerals? And do you have the right to block them from protesting at your own loved one's funeral?
Yeah, so good questions. Why do they protest at children and soldier funerals? They tend to pick events that you can't imagine someone doing this, and they do that to get media coverage. Their whole goal is to get media coverage. So think of the most awful event and mass shootings. I think it was Sandy Hook where you had kindergartners, right, shot. I believe they went to that one. So, it's the stuff that families are grieving, the worst kinds of crimes. Those are the ones they go to. And so yeah, that's why they do it. They do it for media coverage. They're very specific about that. But the good news is that, I didn't mention this, but the Supreme Court, in their decision, in the Snyder-Phelps decision, they said that governments are allowed to place buffers. So you could pass a law that says, funerals are allowed to, or funeral places are allowed to have a buffer of 300 feet, 500 feet, something like that, something reasonable. It's kind of like how police are allowed to block off certain parts of the city when you are protesting, right? Like you can't, or curfew, right? You can't be out after a certain time. There's some gray area there, but police are allowed to have some kind of buffer. What they cannot do is outright ban protests. You can't pass a law that says no protesting at funerals. You can't do that. You can place a reasonable buffer, and you can counter protest. And that's a lot of times now you have a lot of military groups, veterans groups, who are counter protesting. And that's you have the right to do that too. So I will say that Texas does not have any buffer laws that I'm aware of. but we do have a lot of counter protesters when they do come this way. So.
Thank you. That is good to know. Thank you so much for the different talks. There's still a lot of questions in the chat. If you have a lot of questions for one of the speakers, please reach out to them. The recording will be available online. Please reach out to the speakers. I'm sure that they would be happy to continue conversations with you and learn, and so that you can learn more about these fascinating subjects that we've had. Please look in the live event Q&A to see the attendance form. Professor Mertens Wilson is going to be posting the attendance form here, and we will also be posting a recording of this. If you have any other questions, please let us know. Thank you so much for coming today and joining us. This has been a fascinating conversation and just a wonderful year that we've had doing these protest talks, and keep an eye out for fun events to come in fall 2021. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.